My name is Camila Rosas, and today I'm from Chile. And today I will present to you my research project that I carried out as an undergraduate student, which is titled, I think that if you only know language, I say English, just an interjection or a sign of something else. What evolving code-switching patterns tell us about non-immersion bilinguals. So why was the study born? This study was born from a need to understand what becoming bilingual entailed, and specifically what the use of code switching entailed. So I was wondering what happens with my proficiency. As my proficiency was growing, I was starting to code switch more often, but this also meant me having problems in my L1. So I was wondering, is there a relationship between code switching and proficiency? What is happening? So for that, we formulated two research questions, which are what role does proficiency play in the code switching performance of students in the Chilean EFL teaching major? And second question is how do contextual factors mediate these students' code switching performance? So this presentation will be divided in three. First, we'll start by presenting studies carried out in bilingual communities or immersion context, and then studies carried out in the educational community, and then we'll go over the present study. So first, let's look at studies carried out in bilingual communities or in immersion context. As you may know, code switching is the intra-term language alternation that is very common among bilinguals, such as the examples we have here. Sorry for bringing this to colación, and a good entre comillas example. These are things that my classmates used to say. And as you can see here, there's the languages are being used within the sentence. This is called intrasentential code switching, and which is known to be the type that more proficient speakers use. And there's also intersentential code switching, which happens between sentences. However, we'll focus on the prior, since it allows us to see how languages interact together better. So from a structural perspective, we know, thanks to Poblak and many more, that intersentential code switching tends to be used by more proficient speakers, since they need a better knowledge of how grammars work together. We also know that the noun is usually the most switched category, since it is easily insertable wherever within the sentence. From a developmental perspective, we know now that code switching is not a sign of confusion, as many researchers used to think, but that it is rather a great form of bilingual ability. For example, children from the age of 2 can code switch like adults, which is very impressive. And they start by switching nouns and adjectives, for example, which are easily insertable, and then move on to phrases and clauses, which are a little bit more complex. These are the developmental stages of code switching. Other cognitive factors that are also very important for code switching are dominance and proficiency. So we know, for example, that code switching tends to be more common in the non-dominant language, as well as the less proficient language, which also tends to be the L2. However, this is not always the case. Since dominance and proficiency are always in interaction, they are reflected in code switching behavior. So as Heredia and Altarribas said, for example, in their study, bilinguals were having problems more in their L1 than in their L2. And this is because they were in continuous contact with their L2 rather than with their L1. So dominance was changing as well as proficiency. So the state is not always stable. Now let's look at some studies carried out in the educational community. Some of these are from immersion context and some are from non-immersion context. So in the educational community, code switching is not as well as looked at as bilingual communities, since in this context, the main focus is on learning the target language. So every opportunity they have, they use it to learn the L2. So it is not viewed as a very positive thing. However, recent research has, like the studies from Tiana and Macaro 2012 and Yotan and Flynn from 2017, say that code switching can be used as a learning tool. So such as a scaffold, for example. And since they observed that children who were learning both Chinese and English actually learned their Chinese better by using their English rather than their exclusive use of Chinese, which is also very impressive. So code switching can be used as a scaffold. This is also what Camille says in his linguistic independence hypothesis, where L1 knowledge is used for L2 acquisition. However, all this research carried out in the educational setting has only focused on code switching as a learning tool, not as a natural bilingual practice. So for that, we will intend to fill this gap by studying the natural code switching patterns of bilinguals in an EFL context. So now let's look at this study. For this study, we had 27 students from a Chilean EFL teaching program. They were volunteers in this study, and they were aged from 18 to 26 years old. There were 16 intermediate students speakers of English and Spanish, and 11 advanced students speakers of English and Spanish. The students took part in what we called controlled conversation sessions. These sessions were created by us, me and my co-author, based on the studies that aimed at controlling language mode, which are the Basel study and the Neuchâtel study. In these sessions, which lasted 30 minutes, students would read a text in English or Spanish, and then they would discuss it in English and Spanish, and then vice versa. What is important to know here is that the first 5 minutes of discussion corresponded to what is known as bidirectional input-output, meaning that if they read a text in English, they would first discuss it in Spanish, and then vice versa, so as to foster code switching. Not necessarily trigger code switching, but just foster the practice. Students also were asked to answer a language background and code switching perceptions questionnaire, which asked several questions regarding the language history and their self-reporting code switching practices as well as their perceptions. This was also a tool created by us, so it's very unique to this study. So what were our findings? Our findings on the controlled conversation sessions were that only 5% of the total of utterances contained code switching. So there are many students who did not code switch. And these students presented several difficulties like pausing and hesitation and a lot of grammaticality. And from that 5% of students who did code switch, there were differences between intermediate and advanced students in the sense of fluency of the switch. As we can see here in the examples, this is an intermediate student who said, we should not avergonzarse. You're in a place and you say, where? All persons know that you are chilote. So here we can see a lot of hesitation and pausing, and also the insertion of simpler constituents like nouns and interjections, which is very different to what this advanced student said. She said, no quiero que digan a tu acento is so British or you sound so posh. No, me gusta mi acento. So here we can see that this is a very smooth switch, unlike the other example, which is called a flagged switch, because we know that a switch is coming. However, in the other example, from the advanced student, we don't really know it. It's a very confident switch, a very smooth switch. And it's also switching a more complex constituent, which is a clause. From that 5% of utterances that contain code switching, 85 of that was intrasentential code switching, which tended to be used by more proficient speakers. But however, in this study, all of students were able to use this type of code switching, regardless of their proficiency. The noun was, however, the most rich constituent, which is in line with previous research. Some of the results from the questionnaire were that students had a rather negative view regarding code switching. So they said that it may be useful sometimes, but that it could make them laugh sometimes or even feel uncomfortable. Only a few participants had an entirely positive attitude towards code switching, saying that it created a new atmosphere in the conversation and that it related to the capacity of or ability of being a real bilingual. This answer was very special because this student did not really know about language theory or bilingual theory or even code switching at the time. So this is very close to what we think now of code switching, so that was very impressive. Now let's look at the first question, which was, what role does proficiency play in the CS performance of students? So we were able to observe that these students had similar patterns to children from immersion context, switching first nouns and adjectives, for example, and then moving on to clauses and phrases, as we saw in the examples. These students were also switching more than noun, which is also in line with previous research, since it is easily insertable wherever within the sentence. However, in this study, proficiency influenced more significantly the fluency of the switch rather than the type. All of students were able to use both types of code switching very well, but the fluency of the switch was very different between intermediate and advanced students. So this is something that we can say that is really influencing their ability, maybe the confidence with which they switch, which is related to the second question on how do contextual factors mediate the students' code switching performance. So in this context, we can see that there was a lot of avoidance. So I was saying that there was a lot of avoidance of code switching. So that may be due because of the non-existence of this practice in this context specifically, mainly because students are more focused on learning their L2 and on using every opportunity they have to practice. However, we saw that this caused a lot of ungrammaticality and pausing and hesitation. So they are actually skipping over the benefits of code switching. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that these students were actually patterning like their immersion counterparts, like children from immersion context and adults from immersion context, even though they are not in continuous contact with their L2. They still are able to develop code switching patterns just like them. And this may be pointing towards the fact that there is something inherent to bilinguals that allows them to code switch and develop these patterns of code switching, even when they are not taught. So the scarcity of code switching is, however, very puzzling, since it makes us wonder what would happen if this practice were fostered. Maybe students would develop more complex patterns, or maybe they would learn their L2 better, as Tiana and Makat observed in the study. We don't really know so far. So there are some limitations to this study. It was an experimental setting, and the amount of data. There were a very few number of participants, and we were only able to meet them once. However, this can be easily fixed in a second study. Here are some selected references. Thank you very much.